Thank you so very much. It's really wonderful to be back here. I've had so many wonderful times doing lectures on very distant subjects over a couple of decades now, actually, which is fun. And this is a new subject, and we have a new collaboration. I'm going to read a little bit, and then the form will change. We've devoted a great deal of time thinking about how to present this lecture. Our analysis was worked out, not in the library, but in the galleries we discussed, in years of discussion together. And because that is the most authentic way of presenting our material, we wanted to replicate that experience tonight as far as possible. Perhaps paradoxically, improvising a lecture after long preparation takes much more work than writing it out. Still, this is justified if improvisation permits the best presentation of our claims.
Normally, a lecture presents new materials, new visuals, new historical information, novel interpretations. We're rather trying to do something different, to get you to think about what you already know. We're trying to get you to see art galleries, places you already know. Normally, however, you go to galleries to see the art on display. We ask that you momentarily turn the act of perception inside out, as it were, and look at the galleries. Doing that, we will demonstrate is an important, indeed an essential way to understand the art displayed. Two omissions should be noted at the start. There are many theories, Marxist, psychoanalytic, whatever, devoted to contemporary urban space. We offer none. Our account is purely about looking. Two, the prehistory of the contemporary art gallery is a very interesting subject, but not ours. So let us begin. No more reading.
Collaboration is fun. This is nice.
Where did you slip that slide in?
There it is. We show this famous figure, the rabbit duck, that the philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein talks about and an art historian Ernst Gombrich does, in a way to play with this idea that we want to turn perception inside out. That is, normally you go to a gallery to see the art, and the gallery is this neutral space. And we want to turn that inside out and look rather at the space and, as it were, foreground what's in the background. So here are some of the points that we're thinking about in these terms. Probably we're not going to get to all of those, but it does give a sense of the agenda. And it's sort of useful at the start to say, well, what are all of the features of this gallery institution that are worth talking about? Now, we have a procedure here to orient us, was that we thought that it would help at the start to talk about one space, not an art gallery, but a museum, the New Whitney, that we're guessing that everyone here has seen, because talking a little about that may give some sense of the kind of discussion we want to proceed with.
Yeah, so David and I went together to the Whitney a few weeks ago, and as we've been going to museums and galleries for many years, as normal, we had some wine in the cafe afterwards and discussed the building, as lots of people in the art world have. And, well, David, what was your impression of the building?
The building is a strange one, isn't it? That we hear a lot of praise, and everyone remembers that the old Whitney was always too crowded, and it could never enlarge itself. And so here we've got this new one. And yet, you see, just the new one, so impressive. And it may be that one of the things, you see, we're playing into the lecture here is that, in a sense, the commercial art gallery has spoiled us, because the best gallery spaces are, for interesting reasons, better than the museum spaces. Is that fair to...
Yeah. Yeah. I want to go back to this. I don't know what I was expecting. And I worked for a while in the meatpacking district, so I saw this building go up. I don't know what I was expecting. I don't know what I wanted it to be. But whatever that might have been, it's not that. And I found it underwhelming. The time I went with David was the first time I'd been. I waited 6 months, let the crowds die down.
Right.
And so, thanks. Yeah, I was sort of underwhelmed by the building. And in a way, I think museums like this are markers in the cities, and they represent the cities that, where they're located. If you go to Tate Modern in London, you cannot help come away from that experience being impressed by the experience of the building, the space, and I found the New Whitney lacking.
There's an interesting commentary that some of you may have seen just now, that the current issue of The Nation has, and you can find this also online, an account that's interesting. In part, it discusses their critic, Barry Schwabsky's account. And it's an interesting account of the museum, whatever you make of it, because it compares and contrasts all the different views. I mean, okay, we look at the staircases. We might look at the galleries themselves. And of course, what we want to do here is we want to start to play this rabbit duck activity of saying, now look, let's think that what we're looking at here is not, the art on display. I mean, this revisionist history of 20th century American art. But let's say that we're looking at as it were, subtract the art out here, flip the perception inside out, and let's talk about looking at the space itself. I mean, the way that those temporary partitions are put in, and to me, the kind of awkwardness of the space, right? I mean, the spaces themselves are maybe not so wonderful.
Well, and then, when we came out of the elevator, your eye is drawn immediately to the doors that lead you out to the balconies, which were, to me, instantly much more interesting. I mean, I've seen all of this work so many times. What I wanted to do was look at the vistas of New York. And so the spaces didn't hold my attention. And the way that you're moved around them, and that the work is displayed in that way, I was more interested in getting outside as soon as I'd gone in.
Yeah, well, here, and of course we get outside. To the
Well, yeah, we went outside here. Museums are places to hang out. This was a quote from the press release.
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, obviously they're places to hang out. And the press release was talking a lot about how museums are places for friends to come together, to talk, in this particular case, to look out at the city and appreciate the art from that viewpoint. Well, yeah, we know all of that. So I didn't see what is progressive about this, about colored chairs being placed around the balcony.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I think that's important. It is interesting. Maybe look at this next one of how there are those views and the comfortable places to be in the Whitney are not looking at the art, but looking out, at the river, in effect, at the sewage trucks of New York City. There's a strange, use of their site.
Well, and David and I spent maybe 2 hours sitting here talking about
the site is strange.
What we weren't looking at.
Yeah. So it's interesting to think, what kind of a critical, again, this is to orient us, what kind of a critical perspective you would have on this space. And again, I would keep saying the way that our experience is reinforced so much by looking at the Chelsea galleries.
Yeah. Just to go back for a second to this slide. So I'm being very harsh on the Whitney here. So, but in terms of space, this really dismayed me. Because here's one of my favorite artists, Felix Gonzalez Torres, with his work reduced to kind of cheap lighting design, or a selfie opportunity. And if you Google the New Whitney, that's what you see most of. And I think what institutions are in danger of doing with artists like this that have been held up as representative of a time is turning them into I don't know, in Felix Gonzalez Torres' case, I think he's been made into the Princess Diana of the art world. He can't get old. He can't make any bad work. It becomes uncritiquable. And also he's not around, as a friend said at the weekend, to have any influence on how his work is seen. Now, what his work was about was not being hung in a stairwell as a cheap lighting tactic. And so I find that very dismaying. And also, I find it the job of a museum like the Whitney to go beyond the 5, 10, 15 artists that are constantly perpetuated their reputations as being representative of a particular time as being the only one. They're not.
Right, yeah.
Now, there are other artists that were doing what he did as beautifully, as poetically at that time, and I'd be surprised if anyone knew who they were. And it wouldn't be that difficult to include them here and to do something different so that what you have in the move from the Upper East Side to the meatpacking district is something new. This is not. I mean, there's an artist, I wonder how many people in the room know who he is, Robert Blanchon. The most exquisite work to do with AIDS, dying, similar thrust. Or a Texas artist, his name is John Wilcox, used text to talk about the same time and what was happening around him. Nobody knows who these people are. Now, that's really a problem for me because they're not that difficult to include. They're around. The Fales Library has, you can go and look at Robert Blanchon's work at the Fales Library. It should be in there. These sort of, it's like sort of the Spice Girls. Everybody has a character. Felix Gonzalez Torres is the sort of poetic, sad AIDS artist, or David Wojnarowicz is the angry AIDS artist. It's ridiculous. It's derivative and it's not inclusive. So, the Whitney Museum, it's more the Whitney Museum of sanctioned American art that we've rubber stamped, and we're, but that would be a lot to put on the side of the building.
That's interesting. And then I guess it's worth talking about that in terms of the way the space works, right? Where a lot of very familiar things are presented. But again, I mean, one thing, of course, we want to start to talk about already, again, contrasting the galleries, is look at the numbers. The Whitney, even on the day we went, long past the opening, was, very crowded. And usually you wouldn't find that kind of crowd in the gallery. So one of the things we want to be sensitive to is a different sociology of these situations. I mean, to put it in a slogan that we want to try to unpack, that if the museums are public spaces with expectations about behavior, the galleries, in a sense, are kind of a club where to enter in the galleries to suppose that you're a member of this art world community or the art world communities, the art students, the collectors, the writers. And it's a very, very different sense of how you look at those spaces. Should we go to one of those sections?
Yeah.
And look at, of course, the locations of the galleries are really interesting, and we thought about that a lot, because merely looking within Manhattan, I mean, you have extraordinary variations between Upper East Side galleries and here, Aquavella, and the kind of grandeur of, townhouses, and then, very different sorts of spaces. Modern spaces, interesting of the construction of the gallery itself as a new space. And of course, all those multiple gallery buildings. I mean, we tend to find, probably like a lot of people, that, to get really upstairs, I mean, you really need that double espresso, don't you, to get all the way up there. And I always find at a certain point in the afternoon, Chelsea kind of defeats me. And I say, no, I'm not going to, even if there's a Piero della Francesca upstairs, I'm not going to go any further. Now, one of the things that's in the back of a lot of this account is that the book that we're playing against is the classic, and it's a real masterpiece. I mean, it's the Brian O'Doherty book, Inside the White Cube. And of course, the thing is that galleries, a lot of them aren't white cubes anymore. But it is interesting for our purposes that there's not, until our account, been a follow-up to that book. That is a book that looks at the aesthetics of the galleries in those terms.
Go on?
Sure.
Yeah, just to sort of illustrate some of the typical differences. I mean, it's not rigid, but Chelsea has this sort of very pristine architecture, and then you can go to somewhere like the ABC no Rio, which is a sort of, describes itself as a center for resistance. It's a community place, bands practice there. There's a vegetarian collective there. They have a gallery, they have exhibition series, and it's been there for 30 years. It's about to be torn down and rebuilt into a glass, modern kind of steel structure. But they resisted that for a while. And so here you have a completely different experience than you would find in Chelsea. There's also the Lower East Side. So the Lower East Side is kind of a hybrid mix, and there are Chelsea galleries moving there right now, but quite different from the Upper East Side. I mean, the Upper East Side, you have to enter through some of them by ringing a bell. I mean, that's a very intimidating experience.
Yeah. And a lot of that entrance, I mean, we really focus on that because, in a way, you can learn a lot about art by thinking about the fact that to see art, there's this transition moment. That is, you come up the stairs in an old master museum or in MoMA, you walk on the level, and the gallery, you enter into a different place. And that transition of coming through that is really quite important because it means that you move off the street from where you're sort of watching out and looking in a practical way to this place where you're meant to slow down and you're meant to look at the art, even if, of course, a lot of the times the art is playing and riffing off of the street in one way or another. So we found ourselves thinking a lot about these transitions, and I think we look at some of the spaces and the kind of transitions that different galleries ask you to experience is very, very interesting, looking place by place. Well, maybe go to
the meat
psychology.
Of it. Yeah. So as David just mentioned, the sort of genesis of the book was the idea of entering a gallery, which is fraught with all kinds of dangers for the uninitiated.
Sure, this is good.
We went through this afternoon several times.
Mary Boone, it took me 3 tries.
3 tries.
To find left door, forward, right door, and of course the point of it is, I mean, the cartoon is apt there, that you feel like you're not a member of the club. If it takes you 4 tries, then you really, you don't know the place, right? You just don't.
Yeah.
And that's a little detail, but I mean, it's not insignificant. A museum, wants to say, welcome, come in, right? With a gallery, it's a little...
Not so much. Ostensibly public places, but nobody would go into some of these galleries. They're not welcoming. They don't have the great porticos of museums. This book began about 3 years ago. We were in the Robert Miller Gallery in Chelsea, and David suggested that we write this book about the space. And what excited me so much about the idea of doing a book about this space rather than the art within it was one of my own early experiences and the trauma involved in it. So I lived in London for a long time, and my partner at the time lived on Chisenhale Road. So I passed by the Chisenhale Gallery, which is a major London gallery, every day. And I had gone to London for art school, but was very uncomfortable with the sort of culture of it and getting to know it. And the Chisenhale represented that discomfort. Every night I'd go by, once a month the doors would be open and there'd be a crowd there. I was dying to go in. I knew that something about crossing that threshold was like inviting a vampire in. I would be leaving behind something more than the street, something of my background. Yeah. And my working class sort of apprehension about what galleries were and represented. The Chisenhale has a canal at the back, so it has a moat. It has black spikes outside. It has its run down. Has this tiny little door and this roller door that's never open. Yeah. It had hours advertised outside, but you never dared. I couldn't do it. I couldn't go in. I couldn't get past it. And then when I did, finally, it was this pristine, glittering space. And I had sort of pushed through. I'd gone through something psychological and emotional, as well as just crossing over a doorway. Yeah. So the idea of space, gallery spaces, has always remained with me. But as I've become more comfortable over the years, I don't care how many times it takes me to get in or push or pull the door. But in the beginning, it was something to
Yeah.
get past.
I think this is, Darren, this is a really important point, because as the past couple of years when I've talked this project with friends, I realized that within the art world, and I can probably speak for most of us here, we take all of these conventions for granted because, again, we're members of a club. But when you look at the larger public, I mean, I've talked to people, middle-class academics or whatever, who I started to explain the book, I remember, to one woman in Pittsburgh, and she said, it's interesting. She said, well, she'd never been in a gallery. And I thought, this was an exotic. It's like saying to someone, well, oysters. Oh, well, I never eaten oysters. Okay, that's interesting. And all these conventions you see of the gallery experience, this in a way is what in this discussion we're trying to tease out bit by bit. And the paradox of them is that they're things that in a way are so self-evident. They're in our face. And yet, you see, when you spell them out in so many words, they're interesting and, we think, very revealing. I mean, even you see this question, Darren's question, are the spaces welcoming or not?
I thought this was interesting because it seems like a sort of video game of doors and things that would close and open. It has this sort of welcoming architecture moving back and with the perspective, but it's along the same lines of what I was saying before, that you have to be you have to get comfortable entering these places, and in the beginning they look something like that.
There we are.
David, terrible.
Yes.
But actually, it's not much different than that. I mean, this is a prison on the Bowery.
Sure. Yeah. And I think you would remark that if you look at the signage, that it's not clear what it is. I mean, unless you know
right.
Speroni already, it's a gallery. But I mean, what kind of facility? And I mean, here. Now, this gallery, I must say, I think a lot of you know, the most complicated, and I would have to give a modest prize for the most perverse entrance. It's on the Upper East Side, right off of Madison, between Madison and Park. There's no sign on the street. And the first time I wanted to see a show there, literally, I walked back and forth. I found one number above it, one number below, and I'm walking. And then I thought, well, and you have to call them. You walk to the back there, and you go to the left. I don't know I'm curious how many people have been to the Half Gallery. And there's a buzzer, no signage, just a black buzzer. You have to know which, the buzzer there. And then they let you in, and then you go upstairs there, and then you can look out on 78th Street. So this is modest prize for the absolute most mysterious entrance to a space.
David's so diplomatic. I think it's the most irritating, pompous gallery in New York.
Well, here we get to the contentious.
You weren't, when we went together, that wasn't your first time.
No, I knew the tricks.
But it took us as long.
Yeah, it took us a while. Well, there it is.
I mean, this is a generalization, but it's another sort of joke in the art world about how non-responsive, maybe sometimes, the gallery staff can be.
Entrances, and shall we?
I don't know. Can we play this video clip? Don't think so. Okay.
Oh, we can.
Doesn't matter.
Maybe keep.
Okay. So this is, the cliche of what you might see. And I've experienced it so often in the last 20 years.
It is an interesting bit of...
That, in the beginning it's part of, I wonder how structured and deliberate some of these experiences that we all have are in setting the tone of your place in relation to the gallery and what you're experiencing. It's difficulty of getting through the doors. At Gagosian today, there's 2 sets of double frosted doors. And then the sort of lack of warmth, let me say, sometimes in galleries. I have become used to it. But last year, I went into a gallery in Chelsea, and for some reason, for the first time in 20 years, I was so obviously ignored by the gallery attendant, and I can't remember the gallery. I said, are you kidding? I said, you don't know why I'm here, or who I am. I'm no one special. But I've come in here to look at the art, and I've just said good morning. And you looked at me, and you looked back at your screen. I said good morning. And I was so furious.
Yeah.
And I've never reacted like that. I don't know what it was. Well, anyway, I was going to review that show, but I just thought, fuck you. I just thought, no. And that's not professional. I should have still reviewed the show, but I just thought, this is not right. This is in a sense, a shop. And you would never go into any kind of shop and have that kind of. So, I mean, it's not, it's generalizing terribly. But it happens, and it happens often enough to, I think, be a problem.
Okay, Darren, but the business about shop, let me
We're
play
coming
with
on
that
to
one.
that.
Because this is really a rich theme here. Because here, I want to summarize the larger account that we'll be doing. The contrast, again, with the museums. Museums are public spaces. They want to welcome everyone. They need all those numbers. Nothing is for sale. The gallery is an interesting, if you put it not against the museum, but against the clothing store, or drugstore, or restaurant, anything. It's an interesting kind of shop because mostly in shops, the people that go to the shop, can at least potentially buy something there. I mean, you don't, as it were, case the joint and say, oh, it's all interesting, unless you're, studying the history of shops as a sociologist. But the art gallery is the one place where, for nearly all of the audience, it's really window shopping. And I think, you see, this plays to a lot of the uneasinesses that you find about the responses to the space. Because, again, we're all familiar with the general economics of the art world, and we can all understand in a general way why art in Chelsea galleries has to be expensive and why most of us, these are not things we're not going to buy. Or even, you see, to play on Darren's point, we're not going to go to the desk and say, I'm sorry, how much is that? I mean, we know that's the wrong response, right? We know that that's not what you're supposed to say.
We should do that tomorrow.
But it is interesting, you see, in relation to this setting. On one hand, public, open to everyone, but on the other hand, exclusionary. And maybe, you see, to play the point there, precisely because the galleries are open to everyone, that there is this need for a kind of psychology of exclusion. I don't know how you want to...
Well, yes, I mean, we interviewed different people when we were writing this book, and I was speaking to Paula Cooper, and I asked her, is your gallery a public space? And she said, of course it's a public space. But who would walk in from the street unless you were in the art world and comfortable enough to do so? They are ostensibly public spaces, but not really.
That's, sure. And this is interesting. We're looking at the Hauser and Wirth, that grand entrance, which is fun. I actually remember a long time ago, taking my mother to Paula Cooper. A respectable person, but it was kind of like, oh, can we just go in there? And again, you see, I mean, it's, I think, important stressing that the gallery world, if you're familiar with it, you take it for granted, but if you're not familiar with it, all kinds of features of it are exotic and therefore interesting. And in a sense, you see, what our analysis is about is trying to, for an art world audience, to focus on the exotic features of these spaces, to show how exotic they are.
And I think to differentiate from the street you've just come from, that you're in this rarefied space, what you're seeing in there is important and valuable. Who's that, Walter Dimmer?
Can I ask a question? Look, you compare it to other retail.
Right.
You call it clothes shops and restaurants, but surely the obvious analogy is to a showroom selling luxury yachts or cars, where people aren't saying, please come and look at our luxury yachts.
Right.
Or, really all that welcoming to a group of school kids who are going to look at cars and say, okay, well, don't make them sticky.
Right.
So they are showrooms, not
Sure.
So think about the price range, you think about the rent they're paying, you think about the dual functions of using the artist by having a publicly open show, but B, attracting the art collector.
Right.
It's a very specialized, rarefied commercial activity.
Yes, no, I agree totally. And I mean, maybe you see with the difference that, whereas I presume that, you know, if you go into a Rolls-Royce showroom, I mean, you're maybe thinking of getting a Rolls-Royce, whereas in the art gallery, I mean, most of the audience is not. Most of the audience is art students, art historians, and people interested in art. And that's so basic to the sociology of this institution. It's interesting. It's interesting. Again, you see, if I go back to this earlier analogy of, well, it's a kind of club. It's a club in terms of looking.
But then why the disdain and the difficulty and the awkwardness? So what if someone's not going to buy something? They might just want to come in and feel comfortable looking. And I can't help wondering how much of it is structured to, well, this may be pure fantasy, but a gallery takes on an artist. There's no inherent value in that artist. The gallery has to build it. And all that is one person's opinion. Now, that artist has no value, and neither do 10,000 other artists that are not part of the gallery roster. So the gallery seems to me physically and architecturally and socially structured to impress upon the visitor, this is important. But you can go in there and think, well, and perhaps to leave thinking that must be great art. This space was beautiful. It was exquisitely curated. I feel I've seen something special. But in the end, you could also leave there thinking, I didn't like that. I don't see the value in it. And there's a danger in the galleries in people thinking that, because you're just one opinion against another. There's nothing really objective.
Perhaps. But, you know, this is one of the points that Darren and I have been arguing about, and let me play the other side, because I think the contention makes this, you know, discussion a very rich one. And maybe I come at this, you know, as someone who's spent a lot of time reading Proust and even writing about him. And so I'm fascinated with all those Proustian arguments about snobbery, which is interesting because, I mean, you can't take snobbery out of the art world. And in a sense, when you're inside, when you sort of know the kinds of things to say, and you don't say like, well, my child, or I could do it, or whatever, then in a sense you have a kind of value. You're part of this community. And if you don't have that, then, I mean, in a peculiar way, it's interesting. You really define yourself as an outsider. There's a great scene in Proust where the young Marcel goes to visit the Baron Chalou, and the Baron asks him, well, sit down in the such and such chair, and the boy sits down in the wrong chair, at which point, of course, the Baron can make fine comedy of, well, you can't tell Louis XIV chair from, I know, who are you? But I mean, in a sense, the gallery is posing all of these tests, and I don't know, maybe they're pleasurable, maybe they're interesting. Yeah.
Now, I'm thinking this is a very interesting point that you're bringing up and that David brought up. And I remember in the 60s, before the institution of MFA programs became popular, you could go into the Marlborough Gerson Gallery, where they have the entire floor of the Fuller Building, and you have $1 billion worth of art on the floor. You have everything from Giacometti to Pollock on the floor. Yeah. And Mrs. Gerson would come out in a house dress, pat you on the head, offer you a cup of coffee, give you a catalog. Everything was very nice. Now, the difference between what's happened. Oh, thank you. The difference between then and what's happened now is that the colleges have instituted all across the country all this captive clientele of art programs. So you don't have colleges instituting necessary programs in yacht buying or sailing.
Right.
So it's a very different kind of thing. So basically, to enforce the value, the hype of this thing, they have to keep this audience captive and large and enforce this kind of snootery because they've got themselves a ready-made mercantile, community underneath waiting to beat into that door. By closing the door, what they're saying is, no, this is an exclusive club, unlike a yacht club, whereupon if you have the money, you can buy it. But in the art world, you have to say, not only do you need the money, but you need the sophistication, and I'm sorry, you're not sophisticated enough. There's that old joke, I mean, it's funny you showed that thing about the Mary Boone door, but there was that old joke, I think it was the New Yorker, about some reporter writing that a woman ran out of Mary Boone at the height of her fame, screaming, well, Bulgari will take my money.
Yeah. Should we skip forward a couple?
Yeah, I think.
Well, we're talking about the environment, but let's maybe move across a couple. you see, we're trying to think about these spaces, and we're trying again to look at the contrast to the museum space. A kind of concern, sort of pushing us slightly forward, is being aware, and this takes us back to that Whitney, that one of the things that's disconcerting about the Whitney, if you come from the galleries, is that so much is hung, that museums, by their very nature, have to do a denser hanging. Now, there are various ways you could argue about that. One is that the museum wants to show the full range of art, and they only have so much floor space, and so you want to put a lot of things up, you know, much more crowded than a gallery would do. The other, of course, is the familiar idea, and we'll have some slides to talk about this later, about the gallery, that the less is really more. That is that the modern form of luxury, particularly in a crowded city like this, is vast emptiness with, you know, not much up on the wall. And that's the luxury that gallery wants to present. Even if we know that the artist, that she painted lots of paintings, we don't want to see too many. I mean, when Darren and I started to go around in galleries, inevitably, at the lesser galleries, we find ourselves saying, oh, let's subtract things, not 5 paintings on the wall, but maybe 2 or 1, no?
Yeah, we sort of re-curate them as we go around. This is, what do you want to say about that? So,
I don't want, maybe go forward and talk about, yeah.
I mean, these are, artists obviously
Yeah,
engage with the spaces in very direct ways.
Yeah.
These were just a few examples, of that. And that's
But
very
maybe this one is especially interesting conceptually, because up to this point, you see, if you go back to that rabbit duck, we've been pretending that the gallery is a container in which you put the art. And I mean, that seems to be very open, because you can put not just a painting or a sculpture, you can put a performance, you can put any sort of stuff, a video in the gallery. But then the cases that are interesting, and we collected some of these, are the ones, you see, where the art becomes an attack on the gallery. And it's interesting to see what you make of these. It seems, in an obvious sort of, I mean, you don't have to be a psychiatrist to think of this, that it's both a love-hate relation to the gallery, right? It's saying, well, the artist is going to take this space and do something with it. Now, I was fascinated with this Chris Burden, the former Vernon Worth, because the claim was that, and this was in the townhouse, the east side, that if enough people went through, you say, poof, it would push. Now, it's one of those moments where you read the brochure and you say, no, I don't think, I'm just really sure that this is not going to push down a townhouse on 69th Street, right? I mean, it's a kind of fiction. It's interesting, that kind of, you see, ambivalence about the gallery space, in the way that, again, lots of art, and here in the museum too, is playing with that kind of feeling. And I think, you see, this is in a way maybe in the kind of dialectic between us what we want to get to here, that there is really for the audience this understandable love-hate relation with the gallery. And this is, I think, a very deep feature about the institution, that it inspires that kind of ambivalence.
Yes, I think over time, I mean, when you get to understand the gallery system, or you get comfortable with them and you see how they work, and then, you know, you become more experienced in operating around that environment, they can lose that initial sort of influence they have over you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, windows are really interesting, aren't they? Because that relates to all this question of what's the relation of the inside to the outside. And the Brian O'Doherty, the classic account was it was a white cube, which meant that it was totally sealed from the external world, that all the lighting was artificial. But now, of course, we have all these other situations. We're here, and then in the next one, well, still enclosed. But then the next one, I think, you see on upper floors.
Today, though, in Chelsea, Luring Augustine, the doors were wide open. And it's so rare to see that. And we felt drawn, yeah. We weren't going to go in, but drawn in. The difference that just that made. Yeah. We didn't stay long, And we were wondering if perhaps not being a big name artist, if they were trying something different. It wasn't a name you'd seek out.
Yeah. And here it's interesting, this is on the 8th floor. And, it's a complicated thing, I would think, for an artist because, the views, you're looking north to Manhattan, the views are spectacular. And you have a sense that for an artist, this must be a complicated situation, right? Because you feel that there's this natural tendency for spectators to turn and look at the city, almost like you want those windows to be shuttered. It's tricky, the way that these spaces work. And again, you see what we're thinking about here is all this inside and outside, and in what sense is to be in a gallery, to be caught in the inside, you see, and caught up in the art, as opposed to looking out in the world. Or this amazing display a couple of years ago of the David Solly paintings along Park Avenue in Lever House, where it was visually accessible 24/7. You could see the paintings right through the windows of the lobby, even when the building was shut.
We've been to this gallery several times together, and there's always the obligatory look out of the window before you look at the art. Buildings have windows, and that has to be dealt with. But along the same lines, you have these spectacular ceilings, which could be simplified or hidden or modified, but they're celebrated, and they're a big part of, at least in Chelsea, these gigantic galleries. And they do, again, sort of distract from the work at times.
Yeah, Darren, that's the point. I wonder if we could say something more of that, because there is a kind of way in which, if the space is spectacular enough, you find yourself looking at the space. Or sometimes we've talked about that feeling of saying, actually the space itself is beautiful enough to enjoy. Do I need even, to have any art in it? Or we see here in the Mary Boone. Again, you see, in terms of the sociology, the best gallery spaces are, for obvious reasons, looking better than the museum spaces. There are fewer people, and if you just think of this economics, after all, museums rehang, but they don't rehang with the speed of gallery exhibitions, which come up and up and up. And even the simple things I'm talking to gallery people when aware of, it's like, if at every show you rearrange the walls, you repaint the whole gallery and so forth. This is a very elaborate and luxurious kind of process, thing that museums on the whole simply can't afford. So it's interesting, you see, again, this whole concept of luxury, and so much of our account is about, those ideas of luxury and accessibility. Or here, maybe we show this next one, this joke, if you remember the James Bond movie where there was this Velasquez that was stolen at the time from the National Gallery, and it's not a very distinguished hanging that the villain there, Dr. No, whoever has it, but obviously it is the ultimate in luxury, right? Something that only the villain and his captives can see. And guards and one of the things, to pursue the psychology here, is the gallery system, compared again to museums, enforces a lot of trust, doesn't it? That lots of times the objects are frail, and the assumption is that people know that you're not to touch, that you can walk along, you can get much closer than you can in museums. Museums simply need more guarding, right, than you can find in a gallery, because it's a different sort of public. It's different numbers.
So, the press release is a difficult thing, the press release. It's got to explain the work, but it so rarely does. And then I think maybe the point is not to explain the work. Maybe it's to make it more difficult to understand. This is one of hundreds. I think Hyperallergic, or one of the blogs, does a weekly or monthly worst press release, and they pick out the most extraordinary language. And I just love this one, so I'm going to read. So, Rubens' awe-inspiring sculptures are predicated on synthesis, radically articulated mass, and explosive ideas in 3 dimensions, geological in scope and metatastic in formation, These rhizomatic structures brim with dark energy, pointing to the inexorable proliferation of man-made refuse. Well, in other words, these giant sculptures are made from garbage.
Well, but that's,
Now, I like the show. I reviewed the show,
Yeah.
and then I read the press release, and I just,
Yeah.
it was one of the ones that stuck out that week. It's nonsensical.
it's a bit again of the, to play the contrast here, Darren, is that in a gallery show, nearly always we expect a press release at the desk, right? Museums wouldn't do that, but museums give you a map. It's interesting if you think about the very entrance again, you see plays in a different kind of, in a museum you have to be guided through what rooms you go through in what order. That's not a concern because the galleries are smaller. One bit of the sociology that we haven't, it's harder to integrate into this presentation here, is to simply contrast the experience. I mean, let's suppose one morning you go to the Met. Well, any kind of reasonable experience of the Met, you could easily spend the good part of the day going one section after another and maybe in some historical order. Whereas in the galleries, I mean, you go one, you go to the next. I mean, you're seeing this kind of, in a sense, art fair, one place after another after another. So it's a very different kind of looking experience. And all those transitions from one gallery to the next are very different. I mean, we don't have the kind of ordering where in a museum collection where we expect, as in that Whitney, a kind of historical perspective, where that would be the natural thing. So the gallery is very, very different in all these ways.
But it's kind of a literary map. I mean, a gallery doesn't require a map.
Right.
But this is a sort of literary version of that.
Right. Well, and maybe a way to play that further, and we can, get to the, again, things we want to debate about, is that here's the way I would put the point about the galleries briefly and dogmatically. That, and again, in contrast to the museum, that art is in a museum, it means that its value has been sort of assumed, it's been a little bit tested, and there it is. It's in this public space. Now that's an idealization, but a useful one. Whereas in the galleries, what's happening, again, the quick idealization, is that these things are being put out to the world as if they want to say, well, look, what are people going to say? Here's this artist, she's young, he's whatever, mid-career. Where does this art stand in relation to the art world? And you see, I would say that in a way, the function of the gallery system, if you want to understand it, so to speak, philosophically, remember I'm a philosopher in background, is that this is a way of defining the value of these works of art by some sort of a, ideally again, some sort of a public discussion, so that in Artforum and Artcritical and other journals, there's some kind of discussion, and when that discussion comes to a rest and we decide whether this artist, whether she belongs in the museum or not. Now, that's admittedly a very idealized and quick case, but it does explain in a way, you see, why the gallery system is so important. Because, to put it in a phrase, without the gallery system, you couldn't have a museum system. I mean, the two are really absolutely linked together and irreversibly linked together.
Yeah, I mean, the review is an interesting thing because it's a shorthand to say that, again, there's value here. If you're in one of, I mean, most peers of mine would, if they had a choice, would want to be in Artforum or Art in America. They've got cachet, they've got that sort of reputation, and they're important in that shorthand way. I don't know how important it is what is said in those reviews, because they are at lightning speed. As soon as they come out, they are sent around the world through Facebook and Twitter and wherever else. And it happens so often at such a rapid pace, and they're disseminated so quickly that I just wonder how many people actually read the reviews of their friends, peers, and so on. What's more important in terms of building reputation and presence and kind of for an artist to try and rise above the morass of thousands of other artists is the mere fact that you were in it. And we talked today about the idea of doing reviews of best and worst shows. and that actually, if you got 5 reviews saying you were the worst show,
That's a kind of reputation.
that's great.
Say, oh, well, there he is.
I mean, you're
That's
acknowledged
a
as opposed to not
yeah,
being.
yeah. Well, this, I think, Darren, a very important point that this gallery system, I mean, it would be interesting to figure out, I mean, how many people would claim to have seen, you know, a vast number of shows or even the majority of the shows. I think that's, at this point, physically very difficult, right? Because there's simply so much. And what I do, if I can jump ahead there, and let me try this. Now, here you see, I wanted to again talk about modern luxury and in contrast to earlier views, and offer a very quick sociological pass. I mean, in pre-modern cultures, I mean, plenitude is luxury, right? Because things are scarce. I mean, in production, techniques are, you know, slow-moving compared to ours. So look at these, there's this whole tradition of pictures of galleries, these imaginary scenes of what galleries look like. Whereas in our culture, where we're suffering from the opposite, from plenitude, as we all know, the luxury is emptiness, right? And I mean, if you had to rank New York galleries in terms of excellence, I think you would find, on the whole, the less, the better, right? This is the kind of sociology that if one painting is there, this looks very important. Or if a lot of paintings are up, it's overwhelming. It's too much.
That's the same in restaurants.
Sure. The more expensive the restaurant, the less food, right? I mean, this we all as a sort of bit of sociology. If it says all the pasta you can eat, you know, this is not a 3-star Michelin place, right? This is the less.
I mean, you understand it, but it's like what you were saying earlier about artists modifying the spaces, like digging out the floor. That there's a slight antagonism towards the space. And it's the same with a restaurant like that, where
Sure.
you can say, oh, I went here last night,
Yeah.
but you left starving. I mean, it wasn't the
Sure.
best comment.
No, is that side to it.
I mean, that sort of belongs in what we were talking about earlier, about the differences in the scale of museums next to galleries. And their entrances, which announce themselves
Right.
in
Very
ways that
different.
frosted glass and a complete lack of a name on the door doesn't.
Right. And then I guess I got thinking about this because of the crowding. And it is interesting because there's certain sorts of stores, I mean, a carpet store where you take it for granted that there's going to be lots of stuff to see. And if anyone, have you ever had this experience of looking at carpets, it's interesting that in my very modest experience, a kind of snow blindness sets in that you look at 70 or 80 carpets and it's like, then it becomes very hard to say, well, that fourth one and the 17th, weren't those the, you know, it's just simply too much, you're overwhelmed. Or if you look at this kind of secondhand store, this is the antithesis of a grand art gallery, right? Because this is so much. And I mean, we know that there's a lot out there, and yet in the art gallery, we want to see less. This example, a very ingenious one, I reviewed this for Brooklyn Rail. This is a young artist in a gallery in the East Manhattan who pulled out from the front gallery all the wire tubing, and then, you know, thieves sell this on a kind of gray market, and he sold it, and then they had the sales certificate was part of the show. He didn't make very much. You destroyed this whole wall, and I think you only had $24 worth of copper. But it is, again, I see a very interesting example of this kind of show of the ambivalence about these spaces, you know, the kind of uncertainty of how we think about them. And that, of course, is the ultimate space.
I mean, in this city, that strikes quite the contrast because if you compare it to Times Square, where you're overwhelmed with that kind of
Right.
material, here it's reminiscent of it, but it's scaled down to something completely different.
Do you know what I think, Darren? Maybe it's okay with you. Maybe we just show very quickly the material at the end and then go to the questions.
Yeah.
Because I sense a lot of things.
Yeah,
The
maybe.
one kind of issue
Yeah.
that we just pose as a question here, we have less to say about it, is that if you accept this idea we've been proposing, that the function of the gallery system is to establish value of new art, of unshown art, if you take that as a rough promissory note, then you see it's interesting to say, well, could this all be replaced? What could replace it? Well, one thing, of course, would be auctions, because the auction establishes in the most brutal economic way what's the value of this work of art. And the other thing, of course, would be the art fair. And it's very interesting, you see, for our purposes, but very quickly and roughly, the gallery system is beautifully calibrated. The best galleries are so beautiful and wonderful. And who would want to give that up? You see, because you have that perfection when you have this space and you have really smart people thinking of how to organize it. Whereas my experience as a very naive art fair viewer is that this is chaos and confusion because you're walking from one booth to another. But it does, you see, in a way, condense the gallery experience, particularly, of course, for the super rich who are very busy, right? Because here you can simply move through that space and you can see all the contemporary art all gathered in this one space. And so it's a very interesting question for our purposes to ask, well, could a gallery be replaced by the art booth?
Well, you know, we're talking to Philippe de Montebello, and he said he thinks no, they won't be replaced, because people will always want to go and contemplate and reflect on art, and that
Right.
the art fair does not provide that. It's exhausting, and there's no space really to think about what you're looking at.
Right, that's certainly
That's
true.
what the gallery provides, and that's the
Yes.
distinction. His feeling, if you remember,
Right,
was
right, very much, yes.
no.
That's really, well, maybe, should we use that to just
Yes.
ask, why don't we throw this open for questions now?